Welcome. The most profound connection between Africa and America is, without doubt, the forced migration of large numbers of Africans as slaves and their eventual permanent settlement here. What is true for America in the sense of the United States is even more true for many other parts of the Americas, more broadly speaking, including Latin America and the Caribbean. In this lecture, we want to use a very wide lens indeed to survey the scope and overall organization of the Atlantic slave trade. In the next lecture, we want to bring our focus back to Africa, the operation of the slave trade in Africa, and consider its possible long-term effects on the continent. In several recent lectures, I have alluded to something like a turning point, a divide in world history, and in Africa's place in that history, coming about approximately 500 years ago. The year 1992, not that long ago, the year marking the 500th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, of course, across the Atlantic. In that year, some people celebrated his accomplishment and some decried it, but all of them had reason to observe it. This is not because his feat was a first. It almost certainly wasn't. But because it symbolizes the epoch-making changes which followed it. It's what comes in the wake of Columbus's voyage that really matters. I have a cartoon at home which makes this point perhaps in a rather perverse way. It's a cartoon by the cartoonist who wrote under the name, or penned under the name of Larson, and wrote a panel called The Far Side, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. And of course, he has since retired with bagfuls of money. He had a wry, some would say sick, sense of humor, perhaps. The one I have in mind has three Native Americans, three American Indians, and they're standing on a bluff and looking out over the water at the departing three ships, the famous three ships, the Nina, you know, of Columbus as they sail away. And the caption on the cartoon is one of the Native American figures is saying to the others, "Did you think there was something ominous in the way they said, 'See you later'? Did you think there was something ominous in the way they said, 'See you later'?" Well, of course, Native American Indian communities were indeed seen later, maybe I should say sooner rather than later, but seen increasingly by increasing numbers of ships in the centuries which followed Columbus's. So Columbus's voyage symbolizes changes which indeed affected the whole globe, but were particularly profound, it would seem, for the four continents, that is Africa, Europe, and the Americas, bordering the Atlantic Ocean. An Atlantic system was being born, and I'm going to be using that term in these next couple of lectures. An Atlantic system was being born, and an Atlantic slave trade would come to be a central part of it. Now, at a global level, we can speak as well at this time, approximately, of the onset of the age of mercantile capitalism. Now, historians like me are very fond of ages, and we're constantly naming them and redividing them and what have you. The age of mercantile capitalism has had a pretty long run amongst historians. Let's take the second term here. Capitalism, of course, it's a term like state. You can define it a great number of ways. All I would highlight right now is, and emphasize, is that under capitalism, critical economic actors make critical decisions based on calculations of profit. Now, I rush to add that often those calculations are wrong. You know, they're mistaken, but nonetheless, the calculation of it drives actions, determines actions. In the age of mercantile capitalism, and again, that can be defined a number of ways, at one level, the name of the game, if you will, was to go somewhere, obtain things, or persons defined as things, take them somewhere else, either back home or to a third location, and make these actions, invest in those actions in the hope of generating profit. Now, obviously, the precondition for all of this was a quantum leap in the ability to sail the oceans and transport things across them. It may be the stuff of grade school social studies, but we cannot take the Maritime Revolution, so-called, lightly. And of course, Columbus symbolizes that rather well also. Okay, about this time, tastes were changing in Europe, and in this case, I mean changing literally. It seems hard to believe that it was the desire for something sweet, sugar, that initially touched off processes which would utterly change, or in some cases end, the lives of millions of people. After all, sugar is not a staple food. Now, cane sugar, of course, is a tropical or subtropical, at least, crop. It was originally domesticated in New Guinea in the Pacific Ocean. In certain parts of the New World, and when I say New World, I simply mean the Western Hemisphere, notably Brazil and the islands of the Caribbean, conditions were ideal for the production of sugar. Other crops, though, eventually would figure in the system of New World plantation slavery as well, although none would rival sugar in importance over the long haul. And some of those crops, as you know, would be coffee, tobacco, or cotton. Again, it's worth observing that of those, cotton has the most utility. You can wear it. The others are really luxuries. Some might call them drugs. Tobacco, certainly. Coffee, probably. Sugar, perhaps. So it was traffic in these things, not basic foodstuffs or that ilk, that was the basis of the system. That in itself I find rather sobering. Now, there was surely money to be made. There was surely profit to be generated from New World sugar and the other commodities which I mentioned. But to stay with sugar for a moment, the production and extraction, refinement of sugar is a labor-intensive process. Where would this labor come from? It is hardly surprising that the Western European colonizers of the New World, Spain, Portugal, England, France, Holland, that they would eventually turn to slavery as the labor solution. After all, slavery, including chattel slavery, the most extreme form, and by chattel slavery, chattel is a legal term basically, I mean that people are legally defined as property, and chattel slavery did indeed become the particular strain that we're talking about, dominant in the New World. Of course, slavery and chattel slavery had a long history in the Old World. Most recently, at the period we're talking about, along the shores of the Mediterranean. In that long history, many groups had been enslaved for many reasons and in many ways. Some of them, but by no means most, were Africans. In our look at the kingdoms of the savannah in West Africa, the Sudanic belt in West Africa, for instance, we noted the long history of commerce between those places and across the Sahara Desert and into the Mediterranean world. We emphasize things like gold and salt, although it is certainly true that in some cases, humans defined as slaves were part of that process. But again, they were by no means the core of the slave labor forces in Southern Europe in the late Middle Ages, beginnings of the modern era. And indeed, the slave systems as a whole in Southern Europe were not central to the European economy in anything like the way they became central to the plantation economies in the New World. It's revealing, perhaps, when we consider that long history of slavery comparatively, to consider where the word comes from into English, or in variations into French and so forth. Its root actually comes from the term Slav, and it is a reference to the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe who had been sold as slaves in the slave markets, particularly which were located on the Black Sea. But again, let's return to our question here. Again, whether slave or free, who is going to constitute the workforce on these plantations, beginning with sugar plantations and mostly on sugar plantations in the New World? Now, in our own time, or in more recent American history, perhaps, it has seemed to become almost natural. It's for many people to assume that plantation laborers were, well, of course, enslaved black Africans. But that was not necessarily inevitable. Think again of the Slavs imparting the very terminology that we're talking about. The ancient Greeks seemed to be equally happy to enslave either dark-skinned persons from the areas of Inner Africa they called Ethiopia, or light-skinned Scythians from North Europe. It is not inevitable that Africans from West and West Central Africa would come to fill the niche they did in the New World economy. Let us consider the possibilities then, okay? As we do so, a number of factors are relevant. Let's highlight one, and that is disease. We know a lot more about disease than we used to do. It's been one of the real growth industries of the historical profession, I think, in the last 3 decades or so. I'm certainly no authority on it, but I certainly, like so many other historians, have found that it opens up new issues, new ways of looking at things that can be very stimulating indeed. Now, vulnerability to disease is heightened by a population's lack of previous exposure to the disease or to the vectors that carry that disease. Exposure of some sort generates, over time, resistance. In a sense, again, without being an epidemiologist here, the logic, it seems to me, is essentially similar to an individual's use of a vaccine. In other words, you're exposed to a bit of what you hope to generally avoid, or avoid the real thing when it comes. So a population's lack of exposure, to turn it over, to a particular kind of disease can increase susceptibility to that disease. So distance between the population and the disease and the carriers of it may be a factor we want to keep in mind here. And I suggest we keep kind of 2 axes when I talk about the distance between a given population and the if you like, the home area, or the original home of a particular disease. 2 axes. One would be longitudinal, if you're looking at the map, in other words, sort of horizontal across. For instance, the divide between the Old World and the New, the Atlantic Ocean. The other axis would be, on the map, vertical. It would be latitudinal. And in this case, I have in mind, in particular, the distance and the contrast between tropical zones and temperate ones on the Earth's surface. Now, it's back to our question then about who will constitute this workforce on the plantations of the New World. Well, What about Native Americans? What about Indians, American Indians? After all, they are in situ. They're already there. Rather quickly, that possibility came to be all but eliminated. And disease was the key. It's, I think, proper to use a term like population catastrophe to refer to what happened demographically to American Indian, Native American populations in the centuries, especially the first century, after Columbus's voyage. The numbers are staggering in some cases of the deaths resulting from old world diseases like smallpox or measles. Just to give you some examples here, this is drawn from Edward Reynolds' books, but he uses figures of 90 to 95% reduction in the population of the New World. In total, in the Americas, he offers an estimate of 100 million dropping to something like 10 million, again, in essentially a little more than the century after Columbus. In Mexico, something like 20 million in 1519, a little over 1 million in 1608. In Hispaniola, the island which, of course, is the place that Columbus first touched ground in the New World and now divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the estimate was 60,000 in 1508, 30,000 in 1554, and 500 in 1570. So, in a lot of respects, they simply are physically not available as a workforce on the scale that we're talking about. Even if they had been, remember that Native American populations would have been, in a sense, on their home ground. And that, in turn, would have made, it stands to reason, escape, which I would emphasize is probably the oldest and the most common form of resistance to slavery. It's not the most dramatic, the slave rebellion is the most dramatic, but it would have made escape easier. And in fact, it's worth noting, again, in a comparative study of slavery, that it seems to be very common, and maybe even almost universal, that slavery, particularly the more extreme forms like chattel slavery, almost always involve the transplantation of the enslaved persons, the enslaved population. In other words, the movement of Slavs to the Mediterranean or what have you. And it may well indeed be to, of course, increase or maximize the possibilities of control. We are talking, after all, about the ultimate form of controlled labor. And transplanting people to the alien, the new environment seems to increase that. Okay. Well, what about Europeans themselves? Working class Europeans, of course, that we're talking about. What about them as the labor force in the New World? Now, in this case, the latitudinal, or if you like, the vertical shift, makes a considerable difference here. In other words, the toll was enormous, even for those who went as, the bosses, as the planters or the ship's captains or what have you, of the movement from the temperate zones of Europe into tropical places like the Caribbean or Brazil, let alone going to Africa. This took some toll. In the Caribbean, they use the term seasoning, that a European who came there needed a time of kind of light, workload and so forth in order to get used to this tropical climate. And of course, the different diseases there could have a considerable impact and take a toll on those Europeans. Europeans could also make legal and religious claims against enslavement. And indentured servitude, a different form, was of course only a temporary form of control. Well, what indeed then about Africans? Now, Africa, of course, is part of the Old World, not part of the New. And remember, we've mentioned it several times already in this course, that, for instance, the Sahara, which seems like such a barrier in modern times, even though it came to be traversed frequently once the camel was domesticated in particular. But remember, it's a very young desert. So that if we're talking about the very long run of human history in the Old World, there was, in fact, not that barrier there. And there was therefore a considerable amount of exposure, both over the long run and on that trans-Saharan traffic to diseases, for instance, coming from Europe to Africa or vice versa. In other words, more resistance to the kinds of things that wiped out so many Native Americans. Of course, West and Central Africans, at least, were moving, if we take our other axis, from one tropical zone to another. So they don't suffer the shock in the longitudinal axis, the latitudinal axis, the vertical axis, that the Europeans did. Now, this is not to say that, Africans didn't die in substantial numbers on the plantations of the New World. They did. But, again, compared to the kinds of impact that we got in the other two possibilities we raised, it was less. Now, again, I would simply point out that the kind of shock of resettlement here of West and Central Africans into a New World setting, at least in the short run, not in the long run, the history of the Underground Railroad and so forth shows that escape eventually, of course, becomes a widespread form of resistance. But at least in the short term, it makes escape less likely. Now, all of these options were in fact tried. In fact, some Europeans were actually enslaved and taken to the New World. There were certainly experiments with enslaving Native Americans. And indentured servitude was not always applied to Europeans. In fact, the very first shipload of Africans brought to Virginia, legally speaking, were indentured servants, not slaves. So there were these various, it took some time for this system to crystallize, if you like, but gradually, inexorably, the labor answer, in a sense, came to be enslaved Africans. And the consequences of this over centuries were colossal. But aren't we begging a question here? Weren't Europeans culturally predisposed to enslave Africans? Well, I don't like to straddle fences, but I'm going to say yes and no. As for skin color, there were definitely negative associations in pre- and contemporary European cultures with darkness and with blackness. Associations with evil, with uncleanliness. The old phrase of, is it possible to wash an Ethiopian white? It's a little bit like, can you change the leopard spots and so forth. But again, obviously, the implication of that is an equivalence between darkness and uncleanliness. References to black magic and so forth. There are some counterindications, positive associations with black, judges' robes or the gowns that graduates use and so forth, and some negative with white, association with sickliness or weakness or death. On balance, I would have to say there is a tilt towards the negative imageries for sure, though certainly nothing like what it would become. Now, if it was culturally more acceptable to enslave non-Christians, and again, that religious difference in the early days was often what came to the fore before what we've come to call racial differences. If it was more culturally acceptable to enslave non-Christians, the Africans involved certainly qualified. But so did Native Americans. So again, I return to the notion that it wasn't particularly inevitable, it was not predetermined that it would be Africans from West and Central Africa, black Africans, who would become the enslaved workforce of the New World. In terms of this question between cultural predisposition and the materialist forces that I have outlined in terms of economics and disease, if you like, I would have to conclude that to me is a classic chicken and egg situation. Africans were somewhat more likely to be thought inferior, but as they were actually enslaved and became identified over time with slavery, belief in their inferiority deepened. Slavery and racism were mutually reinforcing. So West and West Central Africa came to play a crucial part in the Atlantic system, the provider of enslaved labor upon which the wealth of the system depended. Again, to go back to sort of middle school social studies, where you may have read of the old triangular system of cheap manufactures going from Europe to Africa, enslaved persons going from Africa to the New World, sugar and coffee and so forth coming back to complete the triangle to Europe. It's an oversimplification. There was a whole lot of coming and going in a whole lot of different directions, but at least it does get us to the notion of an interconnected, interlocking, mutually dependent kind of system. Millions, just how many millions we answer in the millions of Africans, we answer in the next lecture, endured the horror beyond horror, the middle passage. It's almost incomprehensible to think of the chaining and leading of several hundred Africans into the holds of these stinking, creaking ships, where they would spend several weeks in either a reclining or semi-reclining position, awash with seawater, urine, vomit, feces, brought up perhaps once a day, if fortunate, for air and feeding, and resecured. The Middle Passage. This was the largest forced migration in modern history. Now, the making of the modern New World lies obviously outside our scope in this course. But consider this. Before 1800, it changes after 1800, but before 1800, something on the order of 4 out of every 5 persons who crossed the Atlantic and settled in the Americas were Africans. Something like 4 out of 5 who crossed the Atlantic and settled in the Americas came from Africa. Whatever the New World became, Africans were obviously critical in the building of it. And in the years since, they have influenced countless aspects of culture in every part of that new world. Thank you.